Welcome to week 4. We're jumping into GRAS part 2 of the approval criteria voluntary petitioning process, picking up from where we were in the last lecture, which was a general overview of GRAS, the history of GRAS, how it generally works, how it fits into the framework. So today we actually get into the substantive pieces of it. And we always have to be careful when we come into these lectures because we want to get right to the heart of a topic and talk about approval criteria, but we have to step back and say, why are we even talking about GRAS? Why is GRAS applying? And in the previous lectures, we saw that first we have to be a food or a component of food. Of course, if we're not one of these items, we're in a different amendment and potentially in a different act and completely outside of the scope of the FDA. Once we know that we're food, we're talking about added foods. So that distinction of added ingredients, added substances versus naturally occurring, and that distinction matters for adulteration because all of this is about avoiding designation as an adulterated food because of an unapproved food additive or an added ingredient that's deemed unsafe. So in addition to being an added substance, it also needs to be a substance that's subject to the food additive amendment. We can't get to the GRAS exemption unless we are beginning by looking at the food additive amendment. So we have a definition there, indirect and direct food additives. We'll talk about both of those and the application of GRAS to those. The intended use is not primarily to impart color. We have a separate amendment for that, and we'll talk about the approval criteria and the petitioning process for color additives. But if we're talking about something other than something that fits within the food additive amendment that is not there to impart color, and this concept of intended use becomes really important, then we can continue with the GRAS examination. GRAS does not apply to color additives. There isn't that exemption. And finally, we're not on the GRAS list, which is really important because you don't need to do a GRAS determination if the FDA has already made that determination and it's published, as we talked about in the CFR. We talked about that in the last lecture. So if we get through all of that, then we can say, okay, what is the GRAS approval criteria? How do we know our particular added substance, and we are looking specifically at the substance and not at the food as a whole, how do we know our substance is generally recognized as safe? And so we have a limited basis for approval. There's actually only 2 grounds for GRAS: common use as food prior to 1958, or a general recognition of safety among experts. And here's our full definition. There's more in part 170.30, but this is the main introduction to these 2 grounds for GRAS. And right away we can see that we're going to start narrowing the scope of what GRAS fits for. GRAS is going to fit for common uses of food prior to 1958, and we're going to see that it only applies when there's a consensus among scientific experts. So that field, even though it in our minds may sound really big, generally recognized as safe, and that plain language maybe suggests something a little broader, we see that the CFR is really bringing that in to a much narrower basis. So we'll look first at common use as food, and this requires application of specific criteria. It's always a risk when you get into the area of GRAS that you just sort of do a shortcut reasoning. You think, well, people have been eating it for a long time, surely it's GRAS, and you may have a tendency or an inclination to avoid looking at the criteria, but it is important to look at the specifics. And one of the first things we see is that the cutoff date is January 1st, 1958. Here's a picture of a Lucille ball on 1958, New Year's. Gives you a sense of exactly how long this amendment has been around. And we talked about it a little bit, that whether the GRAS system is broken. It's been around for a long time. And so any food that was commonly used prior to 1958, January 1st, 1958, is, if the other criteria met, a GRAS substance. And some of the other criteria, we look at dietary intake, we look at intended use. At the end of this lecture, we'll go over and I'll record the GRAS notification database, and we'll look at some examples there. And we'll see in each of those, whether it's common use as food or based on consensus among experts, we are looking at dietary intake, what level is it safe at, and what intended use is it looking at. And intended use captures the concept of the type of food, the purpose, and any special considerations. Those are outlined in the CFR that's listed. For example, if we have a common use as infant formula or as baby food, and we're trying to broaden that to another category, maybe just general food for all populations, all ages. Does that work? Does the history of use support that broader application? And if it doesn't, if it really is just used with infant formula, for example, then we can't expand that GRAS, and we either need to get the FDA's input and see whether or not that determination is correct, or see if the FDA would agree with a broader determination through a GRAS notification, or do a food additive petition. But we really have to look at the type of food and any special considerations in taking into account how this food can be used and how it was used in order to determine its GRAS status. Common knowledge among experts. This is an area where we start talking about safety, and I think it's because it is these novel substances, but safety is underlying each of these. And safety, we look at common use as food, and we say it's safe because there's a history of use without any side effects or minimal side effects, and therefore we know it's safe. Here we're having experts tell us it's safe, and we have that same bar of proof as a food additive petition. It's just the ability to make that self-determination or to do a voluntary notification and avoid the more rigorous structured approach of a food additive petition. The standard requires common knowledge among experts, essentially through published studies. There is an ability to bring in private clinical data, private studies, but those have to support published studies. So immediately between what we see with common use of food in January 1st, 1958, and common knowledge through published studies, if it's an incredibly new, incredibly novel substance, chances are it's not GRAS, because there's not been the ability to study it in the scientific community, and there isn't that common use in the population or in the general population to support it. So we really are narrowing that scope of what GRAS substances can be. And the main criteria we're looking at, there's a number of things that we put into this analysis of common knowledge among experts, but what we're looking at again is dietary intake, what levels, intended uses, applications, and all of that is speaking to this concept of whether it's reasonable certainty of safety. That's the standard that the FDA wants, either in a self-affirmation or in a notification, to be met. And each of those words is important. We need it to be reasonable, we need it to be certain, and we need to be safe. And so when we do the GRAS affirmations, what this means is that we have to show the good and the bad. If a couple of studies show that there may be a side effect of upset stomach, headache, something that we're not really wanting to show because it doesn't speak to this sort of halo effect of how great the product is or how great the substance is, we need to include it because, one, we can have labeling restrictions that the FDA would recommend, and that's something they'll do through the voluntary notification program. There could be aspects to labeling in addition that maybe say what levels it should be at or what levels for certain populations. All of those things need to be taken into account rather than just looking at the favorable data. And so it's not to say that if there's unfavorable data or unfavorable studies that that's going to ruin the GRAS status. It's just to say that it may bring some limitations onto the GRAS status rather than spoil it. But certainly if you get to a certain level of unfavorable studies, it's going to indicate that there isn't a reasonable certainty of safety, and it's not going to be a good candidate for GRAS. And it may not even be a good candidate for a food additive petition. So it's important to stop and take a minute to remember what we talked about in the first slide. When we talked about in the first slide, we were talking about foods under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Now, prior to 1994, dietary supplements would have been regulated fully as foods. If you had a fish oil supplement and you had a cranberry extract or a preservative you were going to put in, it didn't matter if it was dietary, if it was food, it was all treated the same. 1994, we get the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, DSHEA, and that began to change the treatment. Dietary supplements are still foods in most ways. Their intended use is very similar in that we ingest it orally and we consume and we absorb the nutrients through the stomach, and that's still the heart of the definition for a dietary supplement. But what DSHEA did is it added a definition, a specific definition in 201 FF to define dietary supplements, and that bifurcated this idea of treating them as foods. And so they're similar but different. And then what we also see is a change to the 1958 amendment that says if it's a food, if it's a dietary supplement or dietary ingredient, it's not a food additive. You're not under the amendment. Prior to 1994, you would have been. Subsequent to 1994, everything is now split. You're under DSHEA for dietary ingredients, and you're under the food additive amendment for conventional foods and conventional ingredients. That really matters because what happened in DSHEA is there's this process for new dietary ingredients that hadn't been on the market before, that have to go through this approval process. And rather than create a new approval process, what the FDA did, what Congress did, was recreate the GRAS model to determine whether new dietary ingredients qualified for an exemption, or if they didn't qualify, they had to go through a new dietary ingredient petition to gain recognition. The criteria look incredibly similar, and so in that way, it's easy to confuse them, but it's also easy to conflate the process back down to its original unification and say, well, if it's GRAS for food additive purposes, it's GRAS for dietary supplement purposes. If it's GRAS for, or vice versa, GRAS for dietary supplement must be GRAS for food additive. And that gets really important to separate those and to start by beginning with that discussion. Do we have a food? Do we have a dietary ingredient? Are we asking whether this is an approved food additive, or are we asking whether this is an exempt new dietary ingredient? So we gotta separate in that manner. And it's also really important, this is where labeling meets GRAS. The labeling has to indicate that your product is a conventional food if you're going to claim GRAS status for a food additive. If you start having dietary supplement labeling, maybe structure function claims, maybe a mix-up in how you describe you put a supplement fact panel instead of a nutrient fact panel, this happens, then the FDA may construe your product as a new dietary supplement or as a dietary supplement with a new dietary ingredient, and that GRAS determination doesn't work anymore because that GRAS determination is different for new dietary ingredients than it is for food additives. So labeling matters. Don't conflate the process, and always start with the definitions and make sure you stay true to those definitions. If you start with 201F, stick with that definition all the way through. If you start with 201FF for dietary supplements, stick with that all the way through as well. It's also a good time to pause and compare before we get into this concept of, do we submit a notification? Is it better to do a self-affirmation? It's a question I get a lot. So let's look at the comparison of what the notification, what the GRAS process does versus the food additive petition. Because ultimately what we're saying is we don't want to necessarily get the FDA involved because they may not approve our substance, or we may get a notification that requires us to go into the food additive petition, and we have this fear of the food additive petition process. And we'll definitely cover the food additive petition in more depth in a separate lecture, but here for comparison, we can see they're very similar. We're looking for evidence of safety. How we get that evidence of safety differs between the two processes. For GRAS substances, we're looking for a general recognition, a consensus that people know this substance is safe. Either people know that because there's a population that recognizes that they've been eating it for a long time with no health consequences. That's a consensus that's widely known. Or there's a scientific consensus through published studies that say it's safe. We're pulling in some of that same data and information, especially on the scientific side, for the basis on common recognition by experts in the food additive petition. We're just going through a more rigorous level of review from the FDA. So really, it's the same. It's just the level of review and the level of evidence that's needed between the two processes. I should also note, I meant to talk about it with the common use as food. The FDA initially didn't allow foreign uses to come in. So if it was a traditional tea in China, if it was a traditional food in Saudi Arabia, it didn't matter. It had to be a common use in the U.S. And there's a court case that the FDA attempted to enforce this against a particular importer. It was challenged and struck down, and the court said that the FDA had to recognize foreign use as much as domestic. And so now there's a new regulation that provides some criteria about how to claim a foreign use as common use as a food. And that's something important to note as well. So there's this concept that came out in 1997, and it's the food contact surface. Prior to 1997, we would have called this an indirect food additive, and we talked about that in previous lectures about what that is. And food contact surfaces, FCS, is a new way to describe that concept. And it was under the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act. It was a complete revitalization of the FDA and provided a lot of changes. And one of the changes that came in was this concept of FCS. And what we see in the reading is that FCS can be GRAS, and also that if it's preferred or if there's a question about whether GRAS is appropriate, it can go through a separate notification. So rather than go through what we may call a direct food additive petition, which we would just call a food additive petition, it can go through what we may describe as an indirect food additive petition or FCS notification. It's a little different process, and we'll get into that next week with the food additive petition. But what we can see here is that just because we're calling it an FCS doesn't change the fact that it's still, under the statute, an indirect food additive and therefore still subject to that exemption for GRAS. So we do the same analysis as we would. The one change that we would see is that we're going to look at migration levels to see what, from that contact surface, how much of the added substance is migrating from the surface to the food. And from there, we know what that level is and whether that level is safe. And that's one of the things that we'll look at. And also, you can imagine with food contact surface and the GRAS, the vast majority is going to be based on consensus among experts. There could be some organic, maybe like corn-based food contact surfaces that would qualify as a common uses food, but more often than not, you're going to see it as consensus among experts. So we've alluded to it in the voluntary notification process. It's the same GRAS determination, the same GRAS affirmation that you're going to make for yourself if you're not doing the notification. It's just with FDA review. 170.35 outlines the process. Essentially, it's pretty basic. There's going to be a 30-day confirmation of receipt, at which point the FDA will review and either say there are no questions, it's incomplete, they need more information to make a determination, or that the notifier, the party that wants that FDA review, requests it to stop. And that can be for a number of reasons, mergers, bankruptcy, and it can also be that there maybe is some questions about safety. A lot of things can go into that, and so it can't necessarily read into, when we see that in the notification database, that means that it's got safety concerns. It could be something else. So that's where we are with approval criteria and notifications, and I think what will be helpful is to switch over to the notification database and look at some notifications. All right, so we're back and we're looking at the GRAS notification database, and actually I'll come over to this tab first. And so we're under the page for generally recognized as safe. We can see that this is kind of the chain that you can get to. You can also just Google from the outside, do a search engine search for the generally recognized as safe page. Now there are two databases in here, and it's important not to mix those up. You'll see in two places there is the GRAS notice inventory, and a GRAS, again down here, GRAS notice inventory. That's what we want to look at for new GRAS notifications. There is also the GRAS substances database, SCOGS, and what the GRAS substances database, the SCOGS database, is when we learned about that initial listing of all of the substances that the FDA deemed were GRAS and should not be included in affirmations or determinations, but should be listed. President Nixon at a certain point ordered a review of that. There were some questions about the substances that had been listed, some safety concerns. And that's where we get this concept of interim food additive. Some of those substances were questioned and then given an interim food additive status, which meant that they should be reviewed and either put through a food additive petition or banned. Very controversial things like brominated vegetable oil, BVO, that is banned in most parts of the world since the 60s or 70s, still allowed in the US, and has lingered on the interim food additive side for 30, 40 some odd years. That is there in the SCOGS database, and that's something that is historical, but not maybe relevant if you're looking at particular substances. But if you're trying to gain a sense of how the FDA looks at GRAS notifications today, it's important to go to the GRAS notice inventory, and that's this tab up here. So this is where that link will take you to. And what you can see is you can conduct a search if you are looking for particular information. Maybe you're looking to see if someone else has done a GRAS notification for a substance you're working with. You can definitely search there. You can get a very strong sense of what the FDA response is. And one of those three responses, FDA has no questions, essentially an approval letter. Here we have an example at the notifier's request, FDA ceased to evaluate. Again, one of the things that happens. And then one of the more interesting ones you can see in here, FDA has no questions. Some uses may require a color additive listing. Again, looking at that intended use. So this is a fourth response that wasn't necessarily covered in the lecture and is not covered in the FDA materials, but it is something that they'll notify you of if there's a potential for that to be used as a color additive. I think there was one more on the second page. Yeah, so here's another one that's being used as that. So you can click on each of these. There's a GRAS notification number, FDA response. If the FDA has not given a response, which we can go to page 1 and see what that looks at. We can see that there are a number of these that are pending. These are all the new ones that the FDA is currently looking at, hasn't made a determination on. Those will be there too. But I wanted to click on a few examples to give you a sense of what that looks like. So here's a newer one, June 6, 2014, CFSAN, Office of Food Additive Safety. And typically what we can do is look to the second or third paragraph to determine whether or not it's based on scientific or common use as food. Actually, I picked a more complicated one because this one does not talk about that, but I think I have a second one. So here we're talking about dried citrus pulp. And here, again, through scientific procedures for use as a moisture retention agent. Talking about intended use, talking about the GRAS basis, scientific procedures. We're looking at what it's being used at, different meats, frozen food entrees, maximum levels. So we're definitely talking about a lot of things. Getting into particle size, water holding, a lot of scientific information, dietary exposure, all of those sort of things are coming into play. And what we'll see is a couple of interesting things. So standard of identity, if that's going to potentially be allowed or not allowed for the GRAS substance, that will be applied there. Here we're looking, as we saw at the beginning, that this is having an application to meat products, whole muscle meat and poultry products at a maximum level of 5%. That's USDA territory, and what we know in this is USDA is given secondary review. So first review, FDA can say yay or nay. If the FDA says nay, the FSIS cannot override that. It's done. It's not going to be allowed as a food additive. If the FDA says yes, then FSIS, Physis, has to become involved and determine whether or not it wants to impose a stricter requirement than what the FDA has imposed. And that's what the discussion here is about. And so you'll see that where the intended use describes FSIS, Physis, regulated products in addition to FDA regulated products. And I see I picked one. Here's an older one. And this is pretty indicative of what you have to do. I really had to go back, and what I did is you can go into the advanced search and you can look for the phrase common use as use common use, not common use as food. That will get you further along. And you'll get a sense of how long it's been since someone has put in a request for common use as food. You can see a lot of these are a lot older. There's probably some other search criteria you can look for. Common use as food is not as prevalent as one can imagine because a lot of it is through scientific procedure, a lot of new ingredients that we're working with, but you will find occasionally that. And again, you look, second paragraph, here we're talking about 10 microbial derived enzyme preparations, and then through common use as food. And here we are, through common use as food, that's their application. They're talking about prior GRAS notifications, and they're going to get into whether or not it's going to, how that common use is being demonstrated. So here's their evidence of common use prior to 1958. So let's see. So it's talking about publication in an article in 1952, article in 1957, and another article in 52. So that's going to be their primary basis of these descriptions in these previous articles. Here again, we have a consultation with the FSIS because it's going to have an application in meat products. And so that's going to be something that we would see as well. So that's two examples that we can see where the FDA has looked at the GRAS notification, and you can click on the GRAS number as well. You can see intended use, basis, notifier, data filing, and so forth, and get the same information about whether or not the FDA has questions. And so here we can look at this notification letter because this one had some questions about color additive status. But this is the best way to learn about GRAS, is to get into the GRAS notification database, look up some of these notifications and read them, see what their basis is, see what kind of ingredients are being used, see how easy or difficult it is to find a GRAS for a particular status, and really spend some time in here. So here we'll just skip right down, potential requirement for color additive petition. So here described as an orangish yellow pattern powder, food products may constitute the use of a color additive under section 201T, which is our definition for color additives. And so it's giving some information about that. And so that's really important. So those are the things that we'll see. You'll either see standard of identity restrictions, labeling restrictions, potential requirements for color additive petitions, or the involvement of FSIS if there's an intended use for meat. So that's going to conclude our lecture for GRAS and GRAS approval criteria. I really encourage, if you haven't looked at a GRAS notification, you haven't been familiar with that process, to spend some time in the GRAS notification database. It's easy to get to, it's all publicly available, and you can get a sense both by clicking on the FDA's letter. You can also search for the company and search for the GRAS notification number to see what their petition looked like. A number of those are publicly available, and that gives you a strong sense of how this works and what the benefits are to doing the notification. I think you'll see that for the most part, these are pretty well put together petitions that the FDA spends time approving. So next week we'll jump into food additive petitions and food contact surface as well, and get into that indirect food additive petition.